Join us as we step back into the candlelit parlors and tightly laced drawing rooms of Victorian Britain, a world that prided itself on manners, morality, and modesty, yet hid one of its most haunting secrets behind the wedding veil. For generations, young brides walked down the aisle not with joy, but with fear, dreading the night that followed their vows. It was a society that preached silence over knowledge, obedience over choice, and duty over desire, where myths about purity and virtue shaped lives more deeply than any law. In this documentary, we uncover the hidden fears, whispered warnings, and unspoken rituals that defined the Victorian wedding night, and trace how those anxieties echo into our world today. This is not just a story about history, it's a story about control, courage, and the long struggle for agency. By the middle of the 19th century, something began to shift. It was faint at first, a handful of private letters. A few pamphlets passed quietly from hand to hand, but it marked the beginning of a rebellion against one of Victorian society's deepest silences. For generations, women had been taught to endure their wedding night in fear, to suffer their marriages in silence, and to accept their bodies as property of the men they married. But now, a small number of them began to question whether that silence had to continue. One of the earliest voices to break through was Caroline Norton, born into privilege but trapped in a brutal marriage. Her husband, George Norton, was violent and controlling. When she tried to leave him in 1836, he took everything, including their children, because the law said they were his by right. Norton's response was not to retreat, but to write. In a series of pamphlets and letters to Parliament, she exposed the legal realities of marriage to the public, that a wife had no rights over her children, no property of her own, and no legal protection from marital assault. Her words shocked polite society. The laws of England, she wrote bitterly, consider a married woman, for many purposes, the slave of her husband. Norton's campaign led to the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, one of the first laws to grant women limited rights to their own children. It was a small step, but for many women, it was the first sign that the structures that had defined their lives might not be immovable after all. Others followed. Josephine Butler, a clergyman's wife and mother of 4, began speaking publicly in the 1860 seconds about the sexual exploitation of women and girls. She is best known for leading the fight against the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to detain and forcibly examine any woman suspected of prostitution. But Butler's campaign went deeper than public health. At its heart was a radical message that women's bodies were not the property of men, not of husbands, not of doctors, not of the state. Her speeches shocked Victorian audiences unused to hearing such ideas from a respectable woman. "It is not purity to demand obedience from the weak," she told a crowd in Liverpool in 1871. "It is tyranny." Butler's work also revealed a crucial truth about the Victorian system. It was built not just on law, but on ignorance. Women could not fight what they did not understand. So writers and reformers began to focus on education, not just literacy or needlework, but sexual knowledge itself. In 1885, a physician named Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, gave a series of lectures in London urging women to learn about their own bodies. She spoke plainly about menstruation, reproduction, and childbirth subjects that had long been considered inappropriate for polite conversation. Her message was simple but revolutionary. Understanding one's body was not shameful. It was a form of power. There were also quieter acts of resistance, ones that did not involve speeches or petitions, but still chipped away at the old order. Some women refused their husbands' advances and moved into separate bedrooms, a small but significant act of defiance. Others wrote novels that challenged the very idea of marriage as a sacred duty. George Eliot, born Mary Ann Evans, filled her fiction with women who questioned their roles, while Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre insisted that love must be based on equality, not submission. These stories were more than entertainment. They were arguments disguised as art, ideas smuggled into drawing rooms and parlors where direct discussion of sex and consent would have been scandalous. The growing suffrage movement added new momentum. Organizations like the Langham Place Circle in London brought together women writers, teachers, and activists to discuss education, employment, and legal reform. Their conversations often turned to marriage not just as a political institution, but as a deeply personal one. They spoke openly about the lack of consent in the marital bed and the need for legal recognition of women's rights within marriage. Their work laid the foundation for a broader feminist movement that would, over the next century, transform not just laws, but expectations. The pushback was fierce. Critics called Butler unwomanly. Norton was denounced as a disgraced wife. Even Blackwell's lectures were labeled indecent. Newspapers mocked these women and clergymen condemned them from the pulpit. Yet they persisted, and their persistence mattered. By the final decades of the century, the conversation about marriage, once confined to whispers, had become a public debate. Newspapers ran editorials on women's legal rights. Parliament began to receive petitions demanding reforms. And while most of the oppressive structures remained firmly in place, they were no longer unquestioned. In the private sphere, the change was slower but just as significant. Women began writing more openly about their experiences about fear, resentment, and the longing for autonomy. Diaries from the 1,880 seconds and 1,890 seconds show a growing awareness that the suffering so many had endured was not inevitable. "I was told this was God's will," wrote one woman in 1892. "But I believe God did not make me to be afraid of my own husband." Sentiments like these, once unthinkable, became increasingly common. The resistance of the Victorian era did not end forced consummation. It did not outlaw marital rape. It did not give women full control over their bodies. But it did something just as important. It broke the silence. It gave language to the suffering that generations of brides had endured without a voice. And once that silence was broken, the system that depended on it was no longer invincible. On a cold evening in March 1863, in a quiet parlor in Bath, Clara Winfield, aged 19, sat silently by the fire while her mother fastened the last pearl buttons of her wedding dress. The house hummed with preparations. The carriage stood ready. The reception supper was being laid. Yet Clara's hands trembled, not with excitement, but with fear. She had met her future husband, Mr. Arthur Jameson, only 3 months earlier. Their engagement had been arranged by both families, a respectable match, his father's shipping fortune complementing her father's legal pedigree. And tomorrow night, as Victorian society expected, the marriage would be consummated. But Clara, like many brides of her generation, did not know exactly what that meant. Victorian England prided itself on propriety, restraint, and moral purity. Yet in its obsession with modesty and silence, it had created a culture of ignorance so profound that many young women entered marriage without the faintest understanding of sex. Diaries and letters from the period reveal the depth of this unpreparedness. In 1854, Eleanor Havers, a newlywed in Sussex, wrote in her journal the night after her wedding, "I lay trembling and confused. I had been told nothing of what would happen, and could not comprehend why my husband approached me so." The paradox of the Victorian age was stark. Public discourse was saturated with sermons on morality, treatises on chastity, and medical warnings about female delicacy. Yet practical information was deliberately withheld. Respectable mothers avoided speaking of sexual matters to their daughters, fearing that even a hint of knowledge might corrupt innocence. Books for young women such as Mrs. Sarah Ellis's The Women of England, 1839, emphasized piety, obedience, and the domestic arts, but never mentioned intercourse. A bride was expected to know how to run a household, not what awaited her in the marriage bed. This silence was reinforced by the law, until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, a woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She became, in the eyes of the law, his dependent, and in the bedroom, his consent was assumed. The Victorian legal system did not recognize marital rape. It was considered impossible because a wife's duty was to submit. In this legal and cultural context, the wedding night loomed not as a private moment of intimacy, but as an unavoidable ritual of surrender. The medical establishment deepened this fear. Mid-19th century doctors routinely described women as naturally passive, sexually fragile, even physically endangered by intercourse. Influential physicians like Dr. William Acton argued in 1857 that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled by sexual feelings of any kind. Such claims, widely repeated, taught brides that desire was not only improper, but unnatural, and that physical pain was to be expected. Medical texts warned that a woman's maidenhead would inevitably tear, and that blood on the sheets was a necessary sign of virtue. Some manuals even suggested that failure to produce such a sign might bring shame or suspicion of premarital impurity. These cultural pressures made the wedding night a stage for anxiety rather than affection. Letters from the period speak of panic attacks, fainting, and tears. One 1871 diary entry by Margaret Lacey, a newlywed in Liverpool, records, "I prayed the ordeal would pass quickly. My husband seemed a stranger in that moment. I felt not joy, but fear." Such accounts were not rare. They were the private, unspoken reality behind the public facade of white gowns and church bells. Even men were shaped by this culture of silence and distortion. Boys received more information than girls, but it was often wrapped in warnings of sin and disease. The Victorian obsession with moral purity, intensified by the fear of prostitution and venereal infection, cast sex as dangerous even within marriage. Manuals for husbands advised restraint and self-control, yet simultaneously insisted on consummation as a duty. Many men approached the wedding night as a task to be completed rather than a shared experience. The result for countless couples was mutual confusion and emotional distance. The architecture of Victorian homes itself reflected these contradictions. In many middle and upper-class houses, the bridal chamber was a carefully staged space, adorned with lace curtains and heavy drapes, but designed more for ceremony than comfort. The marital bed was often a symbol of propriety, and lineage a place where heirs would be conceived rather than intimacy. Some women described their first nights as a performance required by society, witnessed indirectly by the servants who changed the blood-stained sheets the next morning. What made the terror more profound was the absence of alternatives. Marriage was the expected destiny of respectable women. Few had the means or social permission to refuse it. And once vows were spoken, they were bound not just by law, but by religion, morality, and public opinion. To resist a husband's advance was to risk ruin. One Anglican clergyman's marriage guide from 1862 advised brides that a wife's virtue is obedience, and her peace lies in submission. Such sentiments, preached from pulpits and printed in manuals, left many women convinced that fear itself was a sign of righteousness. In this world, the wedding night was not an intimate beginning, but a threshold one that many Victorian brides crossed with trembling hands and racing hearts. It was the night when innocence, ignorance, and expectation collided, often painfully. And it was the night when a woman's life, identity, and even her body ceased to belong entirely to herself. Long before a Victorian bride stepped into her wedding gown, the foundations of her fear were laid in childhood and nursery stories, schoolroom lessons, sermons, and whispered warnings. The society that raised her prized one quality above all others: purity. It was not merely a virtue but a currency, one that determined a woman's marriage prospects, her family's reputation, and her worth in the eyes of the world. From the moment a girl could walk, her behavior was shaped to reflect modesty and restraint. She was taught to sit quietly, to lower her gaze, to speak softly, and above all, to remain innocent. Victorian conduct manuals such as The Young Lady's Guide to Virtue, Economy, and Happiness, 1833, were explicit in their instructions. A respectable girl, they advised, must avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Running, laughing loudly, or being alone with a man could lead to gossip, and gossip could ruin her. Innocence was not just about chastity, it was about ignorance. That ignorance was carefully cultivated. Mothers often deflected questions about reproduction with euphemisms or silence. Girls' boarding schools, though they taught Latin and needlework, rarely discussed anatomy or relationships. A well-bred girl was expected to enter marriage untouched, not only in body but in mind. In many cases, This meant she had no knowledge of what awaited her on her wedding night. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first female physicians in Britain, lamented in 1878 that our daughters are deliberately uneducated in the very knowledge that would shield them from terror. Courtship itself was designed to reinforce this purity. Strict social codes govern every interaction between unmarried men and women. They could meet only under supervision, and correspondence was often read by parents. Physical contact beyond a gloved handshake was scandalous. Even the language of affection was cautious and indirect. Couples spoke of esteem and respect rather than desire. In middle and upper-class society, a woman who expressed or even acknowledged sexual feelings risked being labeled fast, a damning judgment that could end any chance of a respectable match. This culture of purity extended into medicine and science. Victorian physicians widely believed that women were naturally passionless, that they lacked sexual desire altogether. Influential figures like Dr. William Acton, whose writings shaped public opinion, insisted that the majority of women are not very much troubled by sexual feelings. This belief, repeated endlessly in lectures and periodicals, became self-fulfilling. Women who felt desire were told it was unnatural, while those who did not were praised for their virtue. In such an environment, the wedding night became not a moment of shared pleasure, but an ordeal that proper women were expected to endure. Even popular literature reflected these expectations. In novels, heroines fainted at kisses, blushed at proposals, and married without ever confronting the physical realities of love. Their virtue was defined by their passivity. Works like Charlotte Yonge's The Heir of Redcliffe, 1853, or Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, 1855, depicted romance as emotional but never physical. The idea that a woman might anticipate, let alone enjoy, the marriage bed was considered inappropriate for fiction aimed at the respectable classes. The obsession with purity was not just moral, it was economic. Marriage was the cornerstone of Victorian society, and a woman's value on the marriage market was tied to her chastity. Families guarded their daughters' reputations as they would guard a fortune. Scandals involving seduction or even rumors of impropriety could devastate a family's social standing. In such a system, a bride's untouched state was proof of her family's virtue and her future husband's good judgment. Courtship rituals reflected this transactional nature. Engagements were formal, often brokered by families rather than lovers. Love, while desirable, was not required. Compatibility, class, and property took precedence. In many cases, brides had little say in their own futures. Diaries from the period reveal a resigned acceptance. In 1867, Louisa Meredith of Dorset wrote, "It is a good match, and my parents are pleased. I do not know Henry well, but I am told he is kind. I hope I will be happy." Such unions, based on arrangement rather than intimacy, deepened the sense of strangeness that surrounded the wedding night. Religious teaching reinforced these expectations. Anglican sermons warned that female virtue was a sacred trust, to be preserved until marriage and surrendered only within it. Ministers quoted St. Paul's admonition that wives submit to their husbands as to God. Within this framework, a woman's ignorance was portrayed as holy, her submission as righteous. To know too much was to risk moral ruin. To resist was to sin. The consequences of deviation were severe. A woman who lost her virginity outside marriage, even through coercion, faced social death. She could be disowned, shunned, or forced into prostitution. Charitable institutions like the Magdalene Asylums, which housed fallen women, were stark reminders of what awaited those who stepped outside the bounds of purity. Fear of that fate hung over every respectable household. By the time a Victorian woman became a bride, her identity had been shaped by decades of this ideology. Purity was not just expected, it was all she had. And so, on the eve of her wedding, she often approached the unknown with a mixture of duty and dread. Courtship had not prepared her for intimacy. It had prepared her for obedience. It is little wonder, then, that so many Victorian brides trembled as they crossed the threshold of their bridal chambers. They had been taught to be pure above all else, and now, suddenly, that purity was to be surrendered, with no guidance on how or why. By the mid-19th century, Victorian science claimed to explain everything from the origins of species to the workings of the human mind. But when it came to women's bodies, medicine was less a science and more a doctrine of control. The prevailing belief was that women were fragile, passive, and governed by biology so delicate that even a hint of sexual experience could harm them. These so-called medical truths seeped into every corner of Victorian society, shaping not only public policy and education, but also the private fears that haunted brides on their wedding night. The roots of these myths lay in humoral theory, an ancient concept that persisted well into the 1800s. Physicians taught that women were cooler and moister than men, characteristics associated with weakness and emotional volatility. This belief underpinned everything from medical diagnoses to social expectations. Women were advised to avoid intellectual strain, vigorous exercise, and, most critically, sexual stimulation, all of which were thought to upset their delicate internal balance. Intercourse, doctors warned, was a taxing event for the female constitution, one that could cause fainting, nervous collapse, or even madness if undertaken without caution. One of the most influential figures shaping Victorian attitudes toward female sexuality was Dr. William Acton, whose 1857 work, The Functions and Disorders of the Reproductive Organs, became a standard text. Acton argued that women were almost entirely devoid of sexual feeling, and that their true purpose was reproduction, not pleasure. Happily for them, he wrote, many women are not much troubled by sexual feelings of any kind. These words were repeated in medical lectures, popular pamphlets, and even sermons, cementing the idea that a virtuous woman should be indifferent or even repelled by sex. Other physicians went further. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of Britain's leading psychiatrists, claimed that sexual activity could damage a woman's mental health, warning that excessive passion might trigger hysteria or insanity. Dr. Thomas Laycock, a prominent medical theorist, described women as slaves to their reproductive organs, insisting that their minds and bodies were controlled entirely by their menstrual cycles and maternal duties. Such statements, cloaked in the authority of science, became part of the cultural fabric. These medical myths had profound consequences for how brides approached the marriage bed. If a woman had been told all her life that her body was too fragile for physical desire, the sudden expectation of intercourse could feel terrifying. Many genuinely feared that sex would cause injury or illness. Medical texts described the tearing of the hymen in almost surgical detail, warning of bleeding and distress as inevitable. Some even recommended that doctors perform the first penetration under chloroform if a bride was especially sensitive. The Victorian obsession with virginity further distorted medical advice. Physicians reinforced the idea that a bride's virtue could be measured by blood. The sight of a blood stain on the sheets was considered evidence of purity, a grotesque and unscientific belief that placed immense pressure on couples. Failure to produce such evidence could cast suspicion on a woman's chastity, even if the absence of blood was entirely normal. Diaries and letters from the time record the anxiety this caused. One 1872 entry from Emily Rathbone, a new bride in Manchester, reads, "I feared what would happen if there were no blood. Would he think me impure? Would he despise me?" Doctors also pathologized female pleasure itself. The idea that a woman might enjoy sex was treated with suspicion. Pleasure was often associated with moral weakness or disease. Medical journals spoke gravely of nymphomania, a supposed condition characterized by excessive sexual desire, often defined simply as a woman wanting intercourse more than her husband did. Treatments ranged from confinement to surgical removal of the clitoris. These brutal interventions, justified by pseudoscience, reinforced the notion that female sexuality was something to be feared and suppressed. Even the language of medical literature was designed to intimidate. Texts described the womb as a volatile organ, easily disturbed by emotion or activity. They warned that sexual excitement could lead to prolapse, infertility, or permanent nervous exhaustion. The result was a generation of women conditioned to see their bodies as fragile and dangerous, and their sexuality as a threat to their health and sanity. Men, too, absorbed these lessons. Husbands were told that they must train their wives' bodies, to accept intercourse gently and gradually, advice that often took on a paternalistic tone. Marriage guides cautioned men against brutal haste, but also reminded them that a wife's reluctance was natural and even virtuous. This dynamic cemented a pattern in which female fear was normalized and male authority in the bedroom went unquestioned. The effect of these medical myths was profound. They transformed what might have been a moment of intimacy into one of dread. Brides entered marriage convinced that sex was painful, shameful, and potentially dangerous. Husbands, for their part, were taught to see their wives as passive vessels, incapable of or undeserving of pleasure. The result was a culture of silence and misunderstanding, in which fear and ignorance replaced communication and consent. For many Victorian women, the wedding night was not the beginning of a shared life, but the start of a long, uneasy negotiation with their own bodies they had been taught to fear. And behind every trembling bride stood a wall of medical authority, telling her that fear was natural, that pain was expected, and that her body's only true purpose was to serve. For many Victorian women, the wedding ceremony, the vows spoken, the church bells ringing, the gloves and lace and smiles was not the climax of the event. It was merely the prologue. The real ordeal, the one whispered about behind closed doors and rarely discussed even between mothers and daughters, began when the last guest departed and the door of the bridal chamber closed. This was the night society had been preparing them for, yet one about which they knew almost nothing, and it was the night they feared most. The rituals surrounding the wedding night were steeped in centuries of tradition, some of them surprisingly public. Among the upper classes, it was not unusual for friends or servants to lead the couple to their bedchamber, light candles, and prepare the room. In some noble households, the couple would even be ceremonially undressed by attendants, a practice that by the 19th century had become more symbolic, but still survived in muted forms. Diaries from aristocratic brides mention maids unpinning their hair or removing their veils before discreetly withdrawing. The message was clear. This was not simply a private moment between two individuals, but a social milestone, a duty to family, lineage, and society. At the center of this night was a deeply ingrained expectation, consummation. Marriage, in Victorian law and culture, was not considered fully valid until sexual intercourse had taken place. The law of coverture, under which a woman's legal identity merged with her husband's, was reinforced by this act. In the words of a widely read 1858 guide, the bride's manual, "A union unconsummated is but half formed, a promise unfulfilled, a vessel without its keel." Consummation was the moment a bride ceased to be a daughter and became, legally and socially, a wife. But for many women, this moment was one of confusion, pain, and humiliation. Because most had received little or no sexual education, they approached the bed with ignorance and terror. Letters and diaries reveal how common this fear was. In 1874, Louisa Templeton, a clergyman's daughter, wrote, "I was told nothing of what would happen. My mother said only, 'Be patient and it will pass.' I prayed to God as he approached me. I thought I might die." Another bride, Mary Lennox, described her first night as a trial of endurance, not love. These were not isolated accounts. They reflected the experience of an entire generation taught to equate virtue with ignorance. The physical pain often reinforced the psychological fear. The tearing of the hymen, which Victorian doctors insisted was inevitable, was presented as proof of purity. Midwives and older female relatives sometimes inspected the sheets the next morning for signs of blood, and the absence of it could lead to scandal or suspicion. In one notorious case reported in the London press in 1867, a marriage was annulled after a groom claimed his wife had shown no sign of maidenhood, a claim based entirely on the condition of the bedding. That such a deeply personal matter could become a public concern speaks volumes about the era's obsession with chastity. For men, too, the wedding night carried heavy expectations. Society told them that consummation was their duty, an act that proved virility, sealed the marriage, and secured their social standing. Manuals for husbands, like Henry Newcomb's The Husband's Duty, 1863, instructed men to be gentle yet firm, to overcome their wife's modesty, but not to be cruel. Yet, even this language reveals the imbalance of power. A bride's reluctance was not to be respected, only navigated. The very idea of consent was largely absent from Victorian marital discourse. To marry was to consent once and forever. The atmosphere in the bedroom was often heavy with expectation and fear. The bed itself was a stage for performance. Some brides were expected to lie still and submit, as silence and passivity were seen as signs of modesty. Others were encouraged to feign enthusiasm, to reassure their husbands of their virtue and gratitude. For many couples, the first night was awkward and painful. For some, it was traumatic. A few never attempted intercourse again. A small but significant number of marriages were never consummated at all, often due to mutual ignorance or the bride's physical and psychological trauma. Medical intervention was not uncommon in such cases. Physicians offered treatments for vaginismus, a condition they described as a nervous tightening of the muscles that prevented penetration, a diagnosis that modern scholars now recognize was often the result of fear, trauma, or abuse. Treatments ranged from sedation to surgical procedures, and in extreme cases, doctors performed the consummation themselves under anesthesia, a horrifying practice that persisted into the early 20th century. Even when the act was completed, the emotional aftermath could be profound. Some brides described feelings of shame, disgust, or detachment. A letter from Elizabeth Bowden, written in 1882, captures the sense of violation many felt. I felt as though a part of me had been taken, as if I no longer belonged to myself. He kissed me and slept soundly beside me. I lay awake till dawn. Others reported that their husbands became distant or indifferent after the wedding night, as if the consummation had fulfilled their purpose. Yet despite the fear, pain, and confusion, the ritual continued generation after generation because it was more than a private act. It was a social expectation, a legal necessity, and a cultural performance. The Victorian wedding night was not simply about intimacy. It was about ownership, legitimacy, and control. And for the women who lived through it, it was often the night when the ideals of purity and obedience collided violently with the realities of marriage. Behind the lace curtains and the carefully staged romance, the truth was stark. The Victorian wedding night was less a celebration of love than a rite of passage, one that many women entered with dread, endured in silence, and remembered with pain. On paper, Victorian England prided itself on justice, morality, and the sanctity of marriage. But behind the legal language and the sermons on domestic virtue lay a brutal truth. For married women, consent simply did not exist. Once vows were spoken and the register signed, a woman's body was no longer legally her own. The very institution that promised to protect and honor her marriage transformed into a contract of ownership, one that gave her husband complete rights over her body, her property, and even her identity. The legal foundation of this system was coverture, a principle derived from English common law and still firmly in place throughout the 19th century. Under coverture, a married woman's legal existence was covered by her husband's. She could not own property in her name, sign contracts, or bring a lawsuit. More disturbingly, she could not refuse her husband's sexual access. The law viewed marriage as a permanent act of consent, a contract sealed not just for property and status, but for the body itself. As the jurist Sir Matthew Hale wrote in his influential 1736 treatise, The History of the Pleas of the Crown, the husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife. For by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract, the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract. Hale's opinion, written over a century earlier, remained legal gospel throughout the Victorian era. This meant that if a husband forced himself on his wife even violently, it was not considered rape. The crime, by definition, could only occur outside marriage. Police would not intervene, courts would not prosecute, and society would not condemn. The law treated a wife's body as part of her husband's property, something he could use as he saw fit. It is telling that when the first legal discussions about marital rape emerged in the late 19th century, they were not about protecting women's autonomy, but about regulating excessive cruelty within the household. The moral and religious foundations of Victorian society reinforced this legal reality. Protestant sermons regularly described marriage as a wife's duty and submission as her virtue. In countless household manuals, obedience was presented not as a choice, but as a sacred obligation. The widely circulated 1861 handbook, The Wife's Manual, advised women that to refuse a husband's embrace is to deny God's design, while clerics preached that a wife's submission was the cornerstone of a harmonious Christian home. This language echoed in pulpits, parlors, and Parliament alike, made it nearly impossible for a woman to conceive of her own autonomy, much less assert it. Even when husbands were cruel, the legal system offered little recourse. Divorce was technically possible after the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, but it was ruinously expensive and socially ruinous. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A wife, however, had to prove adultery and additional offenses such as cruelty, desertion, or incest, a nearly insurmountable burden. Most women had neither the evidence nor the financial means to pursue a case. Many remained trapped in violent, abusive marriages with no hope of legal protection. Court records and parliamentary debates reveal how deeply entrenched this power imbalance was. In an 1862 divorce case, a judge dismissed a wife's claims of assault and forced intercourse by stating that a husband's authority may be stern and his rights must not be curtailed. Another case, from 1878, involved Sarah Forsyth, a London seamstress whose husband beat and assaulted her nightly. When she petitioned for separation, the court ruled that domestic discipline, though harsh, is not incompatible with the duties of a wife. The decision reflected a widespread belief: a husband's authority, even when brutal, was a private matter, not a public crime. This legal framework profoundly shaped how women approached the wedding night. They knew from their mothers, from sermons, from books that once they were married, refusal was no longer an option. The fear many brides felt was not simply about the unknown mechanics of sex, but about the permanent loss of bodily autonomy. As Mary Chandler, a Yorkshire bride married in 1875, wrote in a letter to her sister, "I feel I have stepped into a cage. The key is in his hand." The law's refusal to recognize marital rape also shaped how men viewed their wives. Husbands were not only granted absolute authority, but were encouraged to see sexual access as a right that did not require negotiation or consent. Advice manuals for men frequently warned against brutality, but even these were less about protecting women and more about preserving marital harmony. As one 1864 guide bluntly put it, a husband's power must be exercised wisely, lest the flower he owns wither under his hand. By the late 19th century, women's rights activists began to challenge this system. Campaigners like Josephine Butler, best known for her crusade against the Contagious Diseases Acts, also spoke out against marital violence and the denial of consent. Feminist writers such as Caroline Norton and Millicent Garrett Fawcett argued that coverture turned wives into legal nonentities, but their voices were often dismissed as radical, even dangerous. Parliament refused to seriously debate the question of marital rape until the 20th century, and it would not become a crime in Britain until 1991, more than a century after Queen Victoria's death. For Victorian brides, however, this was cold comfort. They entered marriage knowing that once they crossed the threshold of the bridal chamber, the law no longer recognized their right to say no. The wedding night was not just a physical ordeal. It was the moment they lost legal sovereignty over their own bodies. It was the night that fear became more than a feeling. It became law. If Victorian brides feared their wedding night, it was not only because of what happened in those first hours, but because of what often followed. For many women, the night that began with trembling hands and unanswered questions marked the beginning of a lifetime of unspoken suffering. The trauma of unwanted sex, the loss of autonomy, and the crushing expectations of obedience rarely ended when the candles burned low. Instead, they became daily realities, endured quietly, discussed rarely, and recorded only in the hidden corners of diaries, letters, and private journals. One of the most striking features of Victorian marriage was the culture of silence that surrounded it. Women were taught from birth that their duty was endurance. They were expected to bear children, manage households, and provide their husbands with companionship regardless of their own emotional or physical state. Complaining about marital relations was considered improper, even shameful. The ideal Victorian wife, as countless etiquette manuals declared, was cheerful in service, silent in suffering. This silence was reinforced by religion, law, and social norms. Clergymen routinely preached that a wife's trials were part of God's plan. In sermons printed in parish newsletters throughout the 1,860 seconds and 1,870 seconds, ministers described marriage as a school of patience, in which women perfected their virtue by submitting to their husband's will. To resist or even to speak of dissatisfaction was seen as a sign of spiritual weakness. One popular marriage guide from 1868 advised wives to bear with gentleness the roughness of a husband's nature, and find peace in knowing it is your sacred burden to soften him. Yet behind closed doors, many women suffered deeply. Diaries and private letters, documents never meant for public eyes, reveal a world of despair and quiet resistance. In 1871, Annabel Farrow of Kent confided to her journal, "Each night I pray he will not come to me. I feel my body recoil as his steps approach. And yet I smile at breakfast, because that is what a good wife must do." Another woman, Julia Barlow, wrote to a friend in 1883, "There is no part of myself that belongs to me. I am a vessel, emptied and filled as he pleases." These testimonies, scattered across archives and family papers, expose the psychological toll of a system that erased female autonomy and normalized marital coercion. Physical consequences often followed. Repeated, unwanted intercourse led to chronic pain, infections, and complications from frequent pregnancies. Victorian medicine, steeped in myths about female anatomy, offered little understanding or relief. Women suffering from what we now recognize as postpartum depression were dismissed as melancholic or hysterical. Others endured miscarriages or dangerous childbirths with little support as their bodies were pushed beyond their limits. Many were pregnant almost constantly. It was not uncommon for a Victorian woman to bear 8, 10, or even 12 children, often at the cost of her health. The psychological effects were no less severe. The language of Victorian psychiatry was filled with diagnoses like hysteria, neurasthenia, and female weakness, many of which were euphemisms for trauma, depression, and sexual violence. Doctors often blamed women themselves for their suffering, attributing it to nervous constitutions or unfulfilled maternal instincts. Some were institutionalized for resisting their husbands or refusing marital intercourse, a legal possibility, since a husband could have his wife committed on the grounds of insanity with minimal evidence. Records from Bethlehem Hospital in London show cases of women admitted after refusing wifely duties, their trauma pathologized rather than addressed. Social isolation compounded this suffering. Women were discouraged from confiding in friends or relatives about marital problems, especially those involving sex. Those who spoke too openly risked being labeled immodest or fallen. Divorce was not only financially ruinous but also socially catastrophic. A divorced woman was often ostracized, unable to remarry, or find respectable work. Many endured their circumstances in silence, believing they had no other choice. As Caroline Norton, one of the first women's rights activists, wrote in 1855, "Marriage is the one contract from which there is no escape, and to which the law gives all power to one party and none to the other." And yet, despite the overwhelming pressure to remain silent, some women found subtle ways to resist. A few refused intimacy altogether, choosing to sleep in separate rooms or feigning illness to avoid their husband's advances. Others poured their anguish into writing diaries, poetry, and even novels that hinted at their suffering beneath layers of metaphor. Writers like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Charlotte Bronte wove critiques of Victorian marriage into their work, giving voice, however, obliquely to the reality so many women endured. Bronte's Jane Eyre, published in 1847, shocked Victorian readers by portraying a heroine who insisted on love built on equality rather than submission. For most, however, the cost of resistance was too high. They endured, they smiled, they bore children, they kept their suffering hidden behind polite conversation and perfectly arranged tea tables. And they passed down, often without intending to. A legacy of silence, one that would haunt generations of women who followed. The terror of the wedding night was only the beginning. For countless Victorian brides, the true horror lay in the years that followed. The long, unbroken stretch of nights they could not refuse. The children they were forced to bear. The pain they were told to ignore, and the silence they were expected to keep. Their suffering was not a secret to those around them. It was simply something society chose not to see. It would take decades of activism, legal reform, and social change before women began to reclaim even the most basic rights over their own bodies. But in the parlors and bedrooms of 19th century England, those rights were almost unimaginable. And for the young women who crossed the threshold of marriage trembling with fear, the horror of that first night was only the prologue to a much longer story, one written in silence, endurance, and survival. If Victorian brides dreaded the wedding night, they often feared what followed even more: motherhood. In an age when contraception was unreliable, misunderstood, or outright condemned, sex almost inevitably led to pregnancy, and pregnancy, in the 19th century, was a dangerous, relentless, and often life-altering experience. For many women, the wedding night was not just the loss of bodily autonomy for one night, but the beginning of an unbroken cycle of conception, childbirth, and recovery repeated until their bodies were exhausted, their health broken, or their lives cut short. Victorian England was a society obsessed with motherhood. A woman's value was measured not by her intellect, ambition, or individuality, but by her ability to produce children, preferably sons. Popular marriage manuals described motherhood as the crown of a woman's purpose. Religious authorities called it a sacred duty. Medical texts referred to pregnancy as a natural destiny and discouraged attempts to limit it. The Reverend James Grant, writing in the Christian Household, 1859, declared, "It is not for a wife to question when or how often she shall bear children, but to accept each new life as heaven's design." The results were predictable. Families with 6, 8, or even 12 children were common, and stories of women dying from exhaustion, infection, or complications were frequent in parish records. The death rate for mothers during childbirth was staggering by modern standards, as high as 1 inch, 200 inches some areas. Postpartum infections, often referred to as childbed fever, swept through maternity wards and private homes alike, claiming thousands of lives each year. And because childbirth was considered a domestic event, most women gave birth at home, attended not by trained physicians but by midwives or family members with limited medical knowledge. The fear of pregnancy was constant and deeply felt. Diaries reveal the quiet dread that haunted many Victorian wives. In 1879, Eleanor Parker, already a mother of 7 at age 32, wrote, "I knew by the morning sickness that it had happened again. I wept in the pantry, for my strength is gone, and yet my duty is not done." Another woman, Martha Blanchard, recorded after her 9th pregnancy, "I begged him to leave me be, but he said it was his right, and I could not refuse. God forgive me, I wished for death." These were not isolated sentiments. They were the unspoken reality of countless women whose bodies became battlegrounds for cultural, legal, and marital expectations. Contraception existed, but it was primitive and shrouded in stigma. Condoms, made from animal intestines or treated linen, were available but expensive, and often ridiculed as unmanly. Withdrawal and abstinence were the most common methods, but both were widely discouraged by religious authorities. Many doctors warned that interrupting intercourse could cause nervous disorders or female weakness. Even discussing contraception was considered obscene. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 made it illegal to distribute information about birth control, and prominent reformers like Charles Knowlton, author of Fruits of Philosophy, 1832, were prosecuted for publishing such material. As a result, most Victorian couples either lacked accurate information or avoided the subject entirely, leaving women with no control over their reproductive fate. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies was immense. Chronic pelvic injuries, uterine prolapse, malnutrition, and anemia were common among women who bore many children. Postpartum depression, though unnamed, was widespread, often dismissed as melancholy or female weakness. Some women were left bedridden for months, while others returned to heavy domestic labor within days of giving birth. And yet, societal expectations showed no mercy. A woman who failed to produce children, or who resisted further pregnancies, was considered selfish, unfeminine, or even immoral. A barren wife, declared in 1865 edition of the Lady's Domestic Companion, is a sorrow to her husband and a blot upon her home. Motherhood also intensified the power imbalance within marriage. The same legal system that denied women control over their bodies granted fathers complete authority over their children. Before the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, mothers had no legal rights to their children if a marriage ended. Even after limited reforms, custody typically remained with the father, reinforcing women's dependence and silencing any thoughts of escape. Many endured abusive marriages for fear of losing their children, a fact well documented in the testimonies collected by early women's rights activists like Caroline Norton and Josephine Butler. The relentless cycle of pregnancy and childbirth became, for many women, a form of captivity. The bedroom and the nursery were two sides of the same prison, one where consent was irrelevant, the other where duty was inescapable. Women's identities were consumed by their roles as wives and mothers. A widow writing in 1886 reflected bitterly, "From my wedding night to my widowhood, I was never free. I was always either carrying, birthing, or nursing a child or recovering from it." Yet, despite this suffering, Victorian society romanticized motherhood. Pain was reinterpreted as virtue, exhaustion as devotion. Paintings, poems, and novels celebrated the self-sacrificing mother as the embodiment of feminine idealism. Even death in childbirth was often portrayed as noble, the ultimate act of service to family and nation. The cultural glorification of maternal suffering made it nearly impossible for women to speak of their pain without being dismissed as ungrateful or unfeminine. In the end, the terror of the wedding night did not end when the lamps were extinguished. For countless Victorian brides, it was merely the opening chapter in a story of relentless motherhood, a story written in blood, sweat, and tears, repeated year after year, child after child. Their bodies were not their own, their choices were not theirs to make, and their suffering was sanctified as virtue. It was a cycle they could neither control nor escape, and it defined the lives of millions of women across Victorian Britain. By the 1870 seconds, the silence around Victorian marriage was beginning to fracture. It didn't break suddenly or cleanly, it splintered, piece by piece, as a handful of women took their suffering into the courts, as newspapers began printing the unthinkable, and as scandals forced the public to confront what they had long refused to see. The very institution that had been treated as sacred and unquestionable, marriage itself, was dragged into public view, and with it came stories of cruelty, coercion, and violation that few Victorians were prepared to hear. One of the earliest cracks appeared in 1869, in the case of Mrs. Georgina Weldon, a well-known singer and philanthropist. Her husband, Harry Weldon, attempted to have her committed to an asylum after she defied his wishes and refused to give up their charitable work. At the time, a husband could have his wife declared insane with little more than a doctor's signature. Georgina, however, managed to avoid incarceration and took her husband to court. Though she ultimately lost the case, the law still favored his authority. The public nature of the trial exposed the imbalance of power within marriage. Newspapers printed excerpts of her testimony, and for the first time, many Victorians were forced to confront how little legal identity a wife truly had. Other cases followed, each one pulling back the curtain a little further. In 1878, the case of R.V. Clarence stunned the public. A husband who knowingly infected his wife with a venereal disease was charged with assault, but the court ruled that because the act occurred within marriage, and because she had consented to sex by marrying him, no crime had been committed. The judgment made headlines and sparked outrage among women's rights advocates, who argued that marriage should not grant immunity from harm. Consent to marriage is not consent to suffering. wrote one activist pamphlet distributed in London that year, a sentence that would echo for decades. Some of the most revealing cases never reached a courtroom, but played out in the pages of the Victorian press. Newspapers like the Times and the Pall Mall Gazette began to print sensational accounts of marital cruelty, often serialized over weeks, gripping the public imagination. One such case in 1886 involved Mrs. Ellen Ball, who fled her husband after years of violent assaults and repeated forced intercourse. When she petitioned for legal separation, the court denied her request, ruling that a husband's rights in the marriage bed cannot be withdrawn. The story provoked widespread public sympathy, and for the first time, editorials questioned whether the legal definition of marriage was itself unjust. The most explosive moment came in 1885, with the publication of journalist W.T. Stead's exposé, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, in the Pall Mall Gazette. Although the article focused primarily on child prostitution and trafficking, its broader message that society ignored sexual violence when it was committed by men resonated deeply. Stead's writing was lurid and sensational, but it forced Parliament to pass the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which raised the age of consent from 13 to 16. The law did not address marital rape that was still considered impossible, but it showed that public outrage could move even the most entrenched Victorian institutions. Scandals involving the aristocracy also played a role in eroding the sanctity of the marriage bed. The Caroline Norton case, though decades earlier, remained a touchstone in public memory. In the 1,880 seconds, similar stories surfaced: wives of MPs and industrialists revealing private abuse in divorce petitions that newspapers eagerly reported. These stories shocked Victorian readers, who had long believed that such cruelty existed only in the slums or among the immoral classes. Now it was clear that it reached into the highest levels of society. One case in particular, the Jackson versus Jackson trial of 1891, marked a turning point. Edith Jackson had left her abusive husband Frederick and gone to live with her family. Frederick responded by breaking into the house, kidnapping her, and locking her in their marital home to force her back into conjugal life. To the surprise of many, the court ruled in Edith's favor, declaring that a husband had no right to imprison his wife, even to enforce marital duties. The decision didn't criminalize marital rape, but it was a major step toward recognizing that marriage did not erase a woman's fundamental rights. Each of these cases, from Georgina Weldon's courtroom battle to Edith Jackson's escape, chipped away at the legal and cultural foundations of Victorian marriage. They didn't topple them entirely, but they revealed their cracks. And once those cracks were visible, reformers widened them with relentless pressure. Feminist organizations cited these cases in pamphlets, public lectures, and parliamentary petitions. Newspapers printed opinion pieces calling for reform. And in homes and drawing rooms across Britain, women began to speak more openly about what had once been unmentionable. Even so, resistance remained fierce. Many judges clung to the belief that marriage was sacred and beyond the reach of the law. Members of Parliament argued that interfering in the marital bedroom would destroy the fabric of British society. Clergymen thundered from their pulpits that wives who resisted their husbands were undermining God's will. Change would be slow, measured not in months or years, but in decades. But something irreversible had begun. The courtroom testimonies, the newspaper scandals, the whispered conversations, they made visible what had long been invisible. They showed that behind the lace curtains and formal portraits of Victorian domestic life lay a reality that was often brutal, coercive, and deeply unjust. And though the system itself remained standing, it was no longer untouchable. By the closing decades of the 19th century, a quiet revolution was taking place not in parliaments or courtrooms, but in lecture halls, laboratories, and medical journals. For generations, science had helped to justify the Victorian system. It had labeled women as passionless, declared their bodies fragile, and treated their suffering as natural. But now, science itself was beginning to change. A new wave of doctors, psychologists, and social thinkers started to question the old assumptions, and with them, the very foundations of how society understood sex, marriage, and desire. The shift was slow and often controversial. Early in the century, medical orthodoxy still clung to the idea that women were biologically incapable of strong sexual feeling. Doctors like William Acton had built entire careers on the claim that the majority of women are not troubled by sexual desire. But by the 1880 seconds, a new generation of physicians was challenging this view. Among them was Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Britain's first licensed female doctor, who argued that women's supposed passivity was not biological but social, the result of ignorance, fear, and repression. "We train our daughters to fear their own bodies," she wrote in 1885, "and then we call that fear nature." Advances in physiology also began to undermine the myths. Researchers studying the nervous system and reproductive organs found no evidence that women were less capable of sexual pleasure. On the contrary, some studies suggested that women's bodies were more complex and sensitive than previously believed. These findings were rarely discussed in polite society, but they circulated among doctors and reformers, slowly shifting the scientific conversation. Meanwhile, a new field psychology was beginning to take shape, and with it came radical new ways of thinking about sexuality. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, a pioneering Austrian psychiatrist, published Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886, a book that cataloged human sexual behaviors in unprecedented detail. While much of his language was judgmental by modern standards, Krafft-Ebing challenged the Victorian belief that female desire was unnatural. He argued that sexual instinct was universal, present in both men and women, and that attempts to suppress it could cause psychological harm. Even more influential was Havelock Ellis, a British physician, and one of the first researchers to study human sexuality scientifically. Ellis spent years collecting first-hand accounts of sexual experiences from women, something no one had attempted before. His findings, published in Studies in the Psychology of Sex, 1897, shattered Victorian myths. Women, Ellis showed, not only experienced desire, but often described it as powerful, complex, and fulfilling when allowed to flourish. One anonymous correspondent wrote, "I was taught to believe I should feel nothing. Instead, I found joy, and with it, resentment that I had been lied to." The language Ellis and others introduced, libido, instinct, psychological repression, gave women new ways to talk about experiences they had long been forced to keep silent. It also revealed the cost of that silence. Doctors began linking conditions like hysteria and neurasthenia not to inherent female weakness, but to the psychological toll of sexual repression. The idea that denying women sexual knowledge or agency could cause real harm was revolutionary and deeply unsettling to a society built on those very denials. These new scientific perspectives did not go unchallenged. Conservative physicians dismissed Ellis as immoral. Religious leaders condemned his work as a threat to public decency. The British press branded Psychopathia Sexualis a manual of perversion. Yet despite the backlash the ideas spread, they were discussed in medical schools, quoted in parliamentary debates, and whispered about in drawing rooms. And slowly, they began to change how people thought about the wedding night, not as a duty to be endured, but as an experience shaped by culture, education, and power. Education itself was part of the transformation. By the 1890 seconds, some women's colleges had begun offering lectures on anatomy and reproduction material once considered too indecent for female students. Early advocates for sex education, like Dr. Alice Vickery, argued that ignorance was not virtue but vulnerability. "Knowledge," she wrote in 1893, "is the only safeguard against fear." Even among the middle classes, where propriety was fiercely guarded, mothers began speaking more openly to their daughters about what to expect in marriage, a small but significant break from generations of silence. The growing awareness of female sexuality also influenced literature and popular culture. Novels that once portrayed women as passive and passionless began to show them as complex individuals with desires of their own. Writers like Sarah Grand, part of the so-called New Woman movement, wrote heroines who rejected loveless marriages and demanded equality in the bedroom as well as in society. Grand's 1893 novel, The Heavenly Twins, shocked Victorian readers by depicting a woman refusing intimacy with a husband who had been unfaithful, a fictional act of resistance that would have been almost unthinkable a generation earlier. Even within marriage, attitudes were beginning to shift, at least among some. Couples influenced by new medical and psychological ideas began to experiment with communication and mutual consent, seeking companionship rather than domination. Diaries from the 1,890 seconds show more frequent references to shared pleasure and mutual decision-making words that would have been rare in earlier decades. These changes were not universal, nor were they swift, but they hinted at a future where the wedding night could be something other than a moment of fear. By the end of the century, the old certainties were crumbling. Science no longer described women as passive. Psychology no longer dismissed their desires, and education was slowly replacing silence with knowledge. The change was incomplete, and many women still entered marriage ignorant and afraid. But for the first time, there was space, however small, for a different story, one in which the wedding night might not be a surrender, but a choice. By the final decades of the 19th century, a new figure began to emerge in Victorian society, one who terrified politicians, scandalized clergymen, and challenged centuries of expectations. Newspapers called her the New Woman. She was educated, outspoken, and determined to control her own life. And perhaps most shocking of all, she was beginning to challenge the very foundations of marriage, including the idea that the wedding night was something to fear. The term New Woman first appeared in the 1,890 seconds, often used mockingly in newspapers and novels. But behind the sneer was a genuine cultural shift. For the first time, significant numbers of women were pursuing higher education, entering the workforce, and demanding legal and political rights. Women's colleges like Girton, founded in 1869, and Newnham, 1871 at Cambridge, produced graduates who were no longer content to live as silent dependents. These women read widely, debated politics, and questioned everything their mothers had been taught to accept without question. This new independence changed how many women viewed marriage. It was no longer the only respectable future available, nor was it necessarily a goal at all. By 1901, census data revealed a growing number of unmarried women in Britain's middle classes, a phenomenon that newspapers dubbed the spinster crisis. Social commentators fretted over this decline in femininity, but many women saw it differently. For the first time, they had the option to remain single, pursue a career, or marry on their own terms. Marriage was becoming a choice, not a sentence. Writers and activists captured this new spirit. Sarah Grand, one of the leading voices of the New Woman movement, argued that women had the right to demand equality not only in public life, but in private life as well. Her 1,894 essay, The New Aspect of the Woman Question, declared, "We ask for no privileges, but for equal rights. We will not be content to be toys nor slaves, nor mere instruments of men's desires." The implication was radical. Marriage should be a partnership emotionally, intellectually, and sexually, rather than a hierarchy. Literature became a battleground for these ideas. Novels like Olive Schreiner's The Story of an African Farm, 1883, and Sarah Grand's The Heavenly Twins, 1893, featured women who rejected traditional marriages or demanded autonomy within them. Even mainstream authors began to explore the idea that a woman might refuse intimacy or insist on mutual consent. These stories shocked Victorian readers, but they also reflected a growing reality. Women were beginning to speak openly about their expectations, including in the bedroom. Education was a crucial part of this transformation. Women who had studied history, science, and philosophy were less willing to accept the myths their mothers had believed. They were better informed about their bodies, more likely to question religious dogma, and increasingly aware of the legal structures that limited their autonomy. This knowledge did not eliminate fear, but it changed its nature. The terror that had once come from ignorance, from not knowing what would happen on the wedding night now, came from something different, the fear of losing control over one's choices. And for many, that was a fear worth fighting. The New Woman also changed men's expectations. Some men welcomed the idea of equality, seeing it as the foundation of a more fulfilling relationship. Others felt threatened. Newspapers published cartoons mocking mannish women in trousers and spectacles, while politicians warned that feminism would destroy the English home. Yet despite the ridicule, the cultural shift was undeniable. Courtship rituals became more mutual. Engagements were based increasingly on affection rather than family arrangement. And while the law still lagged far behind social change, attitudes toward marital intimacy were beginning to evolve. In the private sphere, this new thinking had profound effects. Couples influenced by new woman ideals often approached the wedding night differently. Letters and diaries from the 1,890 seconds reveal a growing emphasis on communication and consent. In one 1897 journal, a bride named Clara Whitfield described a conversation with her fiancé before their wedding. He asked if I was afraid. I told him I was. He said we would wait until I was ready. No one had ever spoken to me that way before. Such moments were still rare, but they signaled a subtle cultural shift. The marriage bed was beginning to be seen not as a husband's right, but as a shared space. Even the church, long the guardian of patriarchal authority, began to adjust its tone. Sermons and marriage manuals published near the turn of the century emphasized mutual affection and companionate marriage. While many clergy still preached wifely obedience, the language was softer, the emphasis less absolute. The idea that a wife might have her own desires, or that intimacy might require her consent, was no longer unthinkable. Still, resistance remained strong. Critics accused the new woman of selfishness and moral decay. Newspapers warned that the declining birth rate among the educated classes was a sign of national weakness. And even progressive men often struggled to abandon the assumptions they had been raised with. Change was uneven, incomplete, and contested, but it was real. By the end of the century, the image of the Victorian bride was no longer singular. She was no longer only the trembling girl stepping into the unknown, nor just the obedient wife submitting to duty. She could also be the educated woman negotiating her marriage as an equal, the writer challenging old ideas in print, or the activist demanding legal recognition of her rights. The new woman did not erase the fear that had haunted generations of brides, but she did something just as significant. She gave women the language, the knowledge, and the power to confront it. By the dawn of the 20th century, the question of marriage had moved beyond parlors and pamphlets. It was no longer just a topic for whispered conversations among women, or scandalous novels read in private. It had become a public debate, one that reached into Parliament, filled the pages of newspapers, and split Victorian society in two. What had once been treated as a sacred, unchangeable institution was now under scrutiny, questioned by activists, academics, politicians, and clergy alike. And at the center of that debate was a simple, explosive question: what did marriage really mean? The old guard answered without hesitation. Marriage, they argued, was the cornerstone of civilization, a sacred contract ordained by God, the foundation of morality, and the guarantor of social order. Without it, society would collapse into chaos. Conservative newspapers like the Morning Post warned that feminist agitation threatened to unravel the fabric of the British home. Politicians gave fiery speeches about the dangers of female independence. Even Queen Victoria herself, who privately disliked many aspects of the women's movement, wrote in an 1870 letter that she considered women's rights campaigns mad, wicked, and foolish. Yet for many, the old answers no longer satisfied. Decades of reform movements, court cases, and scientific discoveries had exposed the darker side of marriage, the violence it concealed, the inequality it enshrined, and the fear it inspired in women. The question was no longer whether marriage was sacred, but whether it was just. Activists like Josephine Butler, Millicent Garrett Fawcett, and Emmeline Pankhurst, leaders in the growing women's suffrage movement, argued that an institution built on coercion and inequality had no claim to moral authority. What sanctity, Fawcett asked in an 1898 speech, can attach to a contract that denies one party the power to refuse? The newspapers of the era reflected the intensity of the debate. Editorials clashed in the pages of the Times, the Daily Telegraph, and the Pall Mall Gazette. Some writers mocked the new woman as a passing fad, insisting that most women were perfectly content with traditional marriage. Others demanded sweeping reform, equal property rights, the criminalization of marital rape, and even the right for women to refuse sexual relations without losing legal protection. The debate was not just legal or moral, it was deeply personal. It forced Victorians to reconsider everything they believed about gender, family, and power. Parliament, too, was drawn into the conflict. In 1891, the landmark Jackson versus Jackson case, in which Edith Jackson successfully challenged her husband's right to imprison her in their home, had set a precedent that chipped away at the doctrine of marital authority. Reformers seized on this momentum, proposing bills to expand women's property rights and legal protections. Many were defeated, often by wide margins. But each debate brought the issue further into the public eye. And with each defeat, the reformers returned stronger, more organized, and more determined. Religious institutions found themselves caught in the middle. Some clergymen doubled down on traditional teachings, insisting that obedience and self-sacrifice were essential virtues of Christian marriage. But others began to question whether those teachings had been misinterpreted. Theologians like Reverend Stanton Coit argued that marriage should be based on mutual consent and spiritual equality, a radical departure from centuries of doctrine. The marriage covenant, Qua preached in 1899, is not a license for one to rule and the other to submit. It is a shared undertaking in which both must be free. Even within families, the debate caused friction. Letters from the period reveal sharp generational divides. Mothers warned daughters not to ruin their chances by speaking too openly about independence. Fathers feared that suffrage and reform would make women unmarriageable. Yet younger women, armed with education and emboldened by activism, increasingly refused to accept a life defined by fear and submission. "I would rather live alone," wrote Frances Willoughby in an 1895 letter to a friend, "than live as my mother did as property." The fear that had once haunted the wedding night was now being discussed openly in public forums. Magazines published essays about consent. Medical journals debated the psychological impact of sexual coercion. Public lectures addressed topics like marital violence and reproductive choice, subjects that, just a generation earlier, would have been considered too indecent to mention. Even the language of law began to shift. Legal scholars proposed new definitions of consent and argued for the concept of conjugal rights to be replaced with mutual rights. Still, resistance remained powerful. The majority of lawmakers, judges, and clergy were men who saw no reason to dismantle a system that had long served their interests. Many women, too, remained deeply attached to traditional ideals of marriage, finding comfort in the roles they had been raised to fulfill. And for all the noise in newspapers and lecture halls, the realities of the bedroom changed slowly. Most brides still entered marriage ignorant of their rights. Most husbands still assumed that consent was permanent. And most of society still preferred not to look too closely at what happened behind closed doors. Yet something irreversible had happened. Marriage was no longer untouchable. It was no longer above criticism. It could be questioned, debated, and eventually reformed. The fear that had once been accepted as natural was now recognized as a symptom of something deeper, an institution built on inequality. And once that truth had been spoken aloud, it could never again be fully silenced. By the turn of the 20th century, the world that young Victorian women were entering was not the same one their mothers had known. The empire was at its height, cities were swelling with industry, and women were stepping into universities, professions, and public life in numbers that would have seemed unimaginable a generation earlier. Yet behind the closed doors of the bedroom in the private world of marriage, much remained unchanged. The last generation of Victorian brides stood with one foot in a new era and one still firmly planted in the old. And in that gap, the fears of the past and the hopes of the future collided. For many young women marrying in the 1892s and early 1900s, the wedding night remained a moment of deep anxiety. Despite the growing conversation around consent and sexuality, formal education on such matters was still rare. Most girls still entered marriage knowing little more than their grandmothers had. Letters from the period are filled with the same trembling anticipation, the same desperate questions. In 1902, Agnes Beattie, a newlywed from Surrey, wrote in her diary. I tried to smile as the guests left, but my heart was racing. No one had told me what would happen, only that it was my duty. This silence endured even in families that prided themselves on being modern. Middle-class parents often believed that too much information would corrupt their daughter's innocence. Schools, even progressive ones, avoided the topic altogether. And while newspapers might now print articles about marital harmony or mutual respect, they rarely discussed physical intimacy directly. Brides might have read novels hinting at love's pleasures, or overheard whispered conversations about a woman's burden, but few received clear guidance. The fear remained, not just of pain, but of humiliation, failure, and the unknown. Yet there were differences too subtle but significant ones. Husbands, particularly among the educated classes, were increasingly aware of the importance of communication and consent. Advice manuals began to shift their tone. Books like Dr. Mary Charlieb's The Duties of Women, 1894, encouraged men to approach the wedding night with patience and sensitivity. The wife, Charlieb wrote, must never be treated as property, but as a partner. Her willingness is as vital to marriage as the vows spoken in church. This was far from universal, but it marked a departure from the blunt language of earlier decades, when a husband's rights were rarely questioned. Some couples began to actively resist the old expectations. Diaries and private letters from the late Victorian period reveal conversations between engaged couples about delaying consummation or about approaching it gradually. In 1899, a Manchester woman named Clara Reeve wrote to her fiancé, "I will be honest, I am frightened, but I want to trust you. Let us take our time and learn together." Her fiancé's reply, preserved in family papers, was equally telling. "I would rather wait a year than have you afraid of me." These kinds of exchanges were still unusual, but they reflected a profound shift in attitudes. Fear was no longer simply accepted, it was something couples might confront together. Even so, the weight of social pressure was immense. Families, clergy, and community all still expected a marriage to be consummated quickly. A bride who hesitated too long risked whispers and speculation. The absence of children within a year could lead to pointed questions and cruel gossip. And the legal system, still shaped by coverture and centuries of precedent, continued to view sexual access as a husband's right. In 1900, a London court dismissed a wife's petition for separation after she refused intercourse for 3 years, declaring that marriage without consummation is no marriage at all. The law remained stubbornly behind the times. For poorer women, change was even slower. Working-class brides often had less education, less access to reformist literature, and fewer legal protections. They were also more dependent on their husbands economically, leaving them with little choice but to accept the realities of marriage. For many, fear was not confined to the wedding night. It was part of daily life. Letters from factory towns and rural villages reveal stories of forced intimacy, repeated pregnancies, and domestic violence that rarely reached the courts or the newspapers. The social revolutions of the late 19th century touched these women's lives only faintly. And yet, even here, cracks were forming. Women's clubs, church groups, and early suffrage organizations spread information about legal rights and reproductive health. Some midwives and doctors quietly offered advice on contraception. And in urban centers, new networks of support, from settlement houses to women's shelters, gave some brides their first real alternatives to endurance. By 1901, when Queen Victoria died and the Edwardian era began, the landscape of marriage had changed, but only partially. The terror of the wedding night still haunted many women. Ignorance and inequality still shaped their experiences, but the silence was no longer total. Knowledge was spreading. Conversations were happening. The first cracks in the walls that had confined women for centuries were widening. One bride's diary from 1900 captures this strange in-between moment. "I am not as my mother was," wrote Emily Croft on the eve of her wedding. "I know something of what will happen, though I do not yet understand it. I am still afraid, but I also believe I have the right to speak, to ask, to refuse. Perhaps that is enough for now." It was a small sentence, quiet, uncertain, almost hesitant, but it represented a profound shift. For the last generation of Victorian brides, fear had not disappeared, but it no longer defined them completely. It shared space with knowledge, with resistance, and with the beginnings of choice. And from those beginnings, the modern conversation about marriage, consent, and intimacy would grow. When Queen Victoria died in January 1901, she left behind more than an empire at its height. She left a society on the verge of transformation. The new century that followed the Edwardian era would not erase the fears that had haunted Victorian brides for generations, but it would begin to reshape them. The conversations that had started as whispers in parlors and pamphlets were now being spoken aloud in universities, debated in Parliament, and printed in the press. And in that growing openness, marriage itself, once a rigid institution, began to bend. The early 20th century brought with it a cultural mood that was lighter, more questioning, and less bound by the iron rules of the past. The Edwardian age was one of social change and experimentation. Cities boomed, new technologies transformed daily life, and ideas that had once seemed radical, like women's suffrage, birth control, and companionate marriage, were now part of public debate. While many older Victorians clung to the belief that a woman's duty was still to obey, bear children, and endure, younger generations were asking something entirely new. Could marriage be based on equality? The term companionate marriage began appearing in books and magazines around 1905. It described a union not based on duty or economic necessity, but on love, mutual respect, and shared goals. It was a dramatic departure from the Victorian model, where a woman's legal identity disappeared into her husband's, and sex was a marital obligation rather than a choice. Advice manuals, which once warned wives to submit cheerfully, now encouraged couples to talk openly about their expectations, even about intimacy. The Modern Marriage Guide, 1907, widely circulated among middle-class readers, advised that a wife's consent must be sought and cherished, not assumed. Such sentences would have been unthinkable half a century earlier. Education, too, was playing a transformative role. By 1910, literacy rates in Britain were near universal, and women were attending universities in growing numbers. They read books on biology, psychology, and even sexual health subjects that had been considered taboo just decades earlier. They were exposed to new ideas about gender roles and relationships. They also began to form opinions about their own bodies and desires, informed not by superstition or silence, but by science and discussion. The result was subtle but powerful. The fear surrounding the wedding night was no longer rooted solely in ignorance. It was increasingly about negotiation, trust, and mutual understanding. These shifts were reflected in how couples approached intimacy. Diaries from Edwardian newlyweds reveal conversations about waiting until both partners felt ready, about using contraception to space pregnancies, and even about pleasure, a concept that had been almost entirely absent from Victorian discourse. One 1908 diary entry from Alice Morton, a school teacher from Yorkshire, captures this new sensibility. "We spoke of it before the wedding, and he asked what I wished. I told him I was frightened. He said he wished for my happiness more than anything. That night, we were careful and gentle, and it was not what I feared." Still, the pace of change varied by class and geography. Among the working classes, economic realities often overshadowed ideals. Poverty, overcrowded housing, and lack of access to education meant that many marriages remained shaped by necessity rather than choice. Women still faced pressure to bear large families, and many still had little say in when or how intimacy occurred. But even in poorer households, the winds of change were felt. Labor unions began to campaign for family planning information, and women's organizations distributed pamphlets about reproductive health. Knowledge, once the privilege of the upper classes, was slowly becoming more widely available. The legal system, too, began to evolve. Laws passed in the early 20th century gradually improved women's position within marriage. The Married Women's Property Acts had already given wives control over their own earnings and property by the late 1800s. In 1907, the Qualification of Women, County and Borough Councils, Act allowed women to serve in local government, strengthening their voice in public life. While marital rape would remain legal in Britain for decades, these incremental changes signaled a slow but undeniable shift toward recognizing women as individuals rather than extensions of their husbands. Perhaps the most visible change was cultural. Popular media novels, plays, and later cinema began portraying marriage in more nuanced ways. Stories about companionate partnerships, shared decision-making, and even women choosing to remain unmarried gained popularity. Characters like new woman heroines in fiction were no longer punished for defying expectations, but were often celebrated. The idea that a woman might refuse a loveless marriage or insist on sexual autonomy was becoming part of mainstream storytelling. And yet, for all this progress, traces of Victorian fear still lingered. Many brides continued to approach their wedding nights with apprehension, shaped by lingering taboos and family silences. The law still presumed a husband's sexual rights, and while conversations about consent were more common, they were far from universal. As late as 1912, a widely used marriage manual still advised that a husband may gently insist where a wife is reluctant, reflecting how deeply entrenched some old ideas remained. The Edwardian era was, in many ways, a bridge between worlds. On one side lay the rigid hierarchies of the Victorian age, the silence, the ignorance, the fear. On the other side lay the possibility of something new, marriages built on choice rather than coercion, intimacy defined by consent rather than obligation. Most couples lived somewhere in the middle, navigating a landscape of changing expectations and lingering traditions. For the last of the Victorian brides, those who came of age in the first years of the new century, the wedding night was no longer just a rite of fear. It was becoming a conversation, a negotiation, a shared experience shaped as much by trust as by tradition. It was still imperfect, still uneven, and still shadowed by the past, but it was also the beginning of something profoundly different. By the time the First World War broke out in 1914, the world that Victorian brides had known was vanishing. Steamships and telegraphs had shrunk the globe, suffragists marched in the streets, and a new century's conflicts were rewriting the very idea of gender roles. And yet, beneath the progress and upheaval, the shadows of the Victorian marriage bed lingered not in law alone, but in habits, expectations, and the deep structures of culture that outlast any single generation. The fear surrounding the wedding night, born of silence, ignorance, and rigid social codes, did not vanish with the death of Queen Victoria. It was simply absorbed into new forms. For decades after the turn of the century, many young women still entered marriage with little knowledge of sex, contraception, or even their own bodies. Letters and diaries from the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds reveal how the Victorian culture of secrecy endured. One bride in Manchester, writing in 1928, confessed that she knew less than nothing about what was expected of her until her wedding night, and that the experience was painful and bewildering. Another, writing from Boston in 1932, described her first night as an ordeal to be survived, not a joy to be shared. This generational persistence was not accidental. Victorian ideals had been woven into the fabric of Western social life in school curriculums, religious instruction, and family traditions. Even as public conversations about sexuality grew more open, they often carried with them the same underlying assumptions: that men were active and women passive, that a wife's duty was to accommodate, and that sexual knowledge was somehow corrupting before marriage. It would take more than changing laws to undo such deeply embedded beliefs. The institutions that had enforced Victorian sexual norms remained powerful well into the 20th century. Churches continued to preach chastity and obedience. Many schools avoided any discussion of reproductive health. Medical professionals, overwhelmingly male, often treated female sexuality as a pathology to be managed, rather than a natural part of life. Even marriage manuals, which had softened their tone since the 19th century, still framed the wedding night as something to be endured rather than explored. The cultural machinery that had once terrified Victorian brides now simply updated its vocabulary. It was not until the upheavals of the mid-20th century world wars, feminist movements, the sexual revolution, that the last vestiges of Victorian thinking began to be seriously challenged. Women's increased participation in the workforce during World War I and World War II destabilized the old domestic hierarchies. The interwar years saw new conversations about companionate marriage and birth control. Activists like Marie Stopes in Britain and Margaret Sanger in the United States fought to make reproductive knowledge more widely available. Their work faced fierce resistance, often framed in the same moral language that had shaped Victorian society, but it marked a turning point. The silence was breaking. Even then, the residue of fear persisted in subtler forms. The idea that a respectable woman should be modest and passive in sexual matters remained entrenched. Many women continued to feel shame about desire, even within marriage. The concept of marital rape, once an unthinkable contradiction, would not be legally recognized in Britain until 1991, more than a century after Victoria's death. Such facts underscore how enduring those 19th century assumptions were, and how deeply they shaped legal and cultural understandings of consent and agency. The influence of Victorian attitudes can still be traced in the present day. Modern wedding rituals, the white dress, the emphasis on virginity, the idea of the wedding night as a climactic first are direct descendants of 19th century ideals. Even contemporary anxieties about sexuality, from purity culture to debates over sex education, echo Victorian fears about morality, gender roles, and control. They are, in many ways, the same conversations, just spoken in a new vocabulary. Yet the legacy is not only negative. The struggles of Victorian brides, their silence, their fears, their resistance laid the groundwork for later generations to demand more. Each hesitant question asked, each taboo broken, each reform fought for helped to chip away at a system that had once seemed immovable. The courage of women who wrote diaries, circulated pamphlets, or whispered forbidden advice to their daughters created the conditions for the more open, informed conversations we have today. And still, those early lessons continue to matter. They remind us that ignorance is not accidental, it is often maintained by those who benefit from it. They show how fear can be used to enforce obedience, and how myths about purity and virtue can serve as tools of control. They also demonstrate how those same tools can be dismantled, piece by piece, through education, conversation, and the relentless assertion of autonomy. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the world of the Victorian bride had faded into history, but its echoes remained in courtrooms, classrooms, churches, and homes. They shaped how generations understood love, sex, and marriage. And if we listen closely, those echoes are still with us today, in the way society talks about female virtue, in the shame that often still surrounds sexuality, and in the enduring struggles over who gets to control the body and on what terms. The fear that once gripped a young bride on her wedding night was never just about that single evening. It was about power, who held it, how it was exercised, and how it was justified. And in that sense, the Victorian wedding night is not merely a relic of the past. It is a mirror, showing us how far we have come and how far we still have to go.